Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
I'm Luann Shepard Mum. I teach high school English and I'm also a poet. I'm here in Bemidji reading as part of the spoken word series for the Bemidji Community Arts Center. This reading is part of the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read Roadshow. And I was joined today by one Bemidji poet, Sean Hill, and Paula Krzyzewski, and Matt Mock from Minneapolis.
And I workshopped this poem in there, and it made it into my book. So, it's called Prayer for the Specialists Who Sooner or Later Will Be Tasked with Fixing Me. Trying to cross Hennepin Avenue at night when it's varnished with rain is dyed by lights of clubs and 24-hour commerce so that it looks like an oriental rug, like the chicken who's just been told the joke about the chicken crossing the road and doesn't get it. I stop in the middle of the street, wonder what tricks a surgeon fixing the body uses. If a patch is worn over the eye that sees the luminescence inside. So a vision of staple and stitch, a shaved sternum, the distance of an imagined end a few hours from now is the thing that allows hand and scalpel to impose order at the heart, a heart that, when you're close in and it's dying, must transfix like a blossom unfolding in a time-lapse film, must be as hypnotic as car horns and city noise converging to make song, like they're following a score you swear they've spent yours and your parents' and your grandparents' lives rehearsing. In the middle of the street, heart of the city, incandescence and fluorescence whisper, neons shout. Can you remember where it was you were in such a hurry to get to?
Well, reading in the round-robin style that we read in here is a lot of fun for the poets because we try to find connections between our poems. And we were just talking about the fact that we end up reading poems that we sometimes don't read usually. We all kind of have our set that we do of our poems that we read, but when someone reads a poem and then one of yours, one that you don't normally read, has a thematic link, then you read that one, and it's fun to try out some new poems. It's also, sometimes when you read for 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, I'm always conscious of, I feel like people are getting bored by the end and it's too much of the same voice. So this style of each of us taking a turn really helps with that.
I'm Sean Hill. I'm a poet, and I helped organize this event today, the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read Roadshow in Bemidji. I wanted to bring poets from outside the area up here that people might not get to hear, different voices. I was energized when I went to the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read down at Normandale College last year and heard 25 to 30 poets reading, a poem each, and got to hear sort of a bunch of different styles, different aesthetics, different voices, and I want to bring that to Bemidji, so people could hear poets like Matt and Paula, and to sort of celebrate, poets in the area like Luann. Get the voices here for the folk, and I think poetry and poetry readings, I've in the past found that they're places where I sort of am nurtured emotionally and creatively. Good poetry readings make me want to create, and my form of creation is writing. So after a good poetry reading, I want to go home and write. I hope that this art will sort of inspire, invigorate. That's what I want my work to do, and that's what I want the work that my fellow poets are sharing to do for an audience, and that's what I was hoping to accomplish here this evening with the community members who came out.
I'm Paula Krzyzewski. I was born in Bemidji, and I've lived around the Midwest. I live in Minneapolis. I've lived there for quite a long time now, and I'm a poet. I have a book called Ghost Fargo that I was reading from tonight, and another book called Upon Arrival, and some new poems. I'm part of the Great Twin City Poetry Roadshow. that Matt Mauck put together right now. So yeah, and it's great to be back in Bemidji because I was raised here for my formative years. So I had hosted other events and other series in the Twin Cities, and Matt and I knew each other. We had read together. He had read at my events, and then he's just so inclusive, you know, that I read at the inaugural with Luann and about 30 other people. And so it's been really lucky to be able to be part of it, you know, and to be able to come back up here for this first one.
I'm a poet and a teacher, and I live in the Twin Cities. And I go to a lot of readings in town, and you always see different groups of people at different readings and different styles of poetry being read. And I thought it'd be great if all these people could come together and do a single reading once a year. And so I came up with this idea, the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read. 25, 30 poets, everybody comes, reads one poem. Had no idea how it was going to work or not that first year, and it turned out to be a success. So we did it a second year and just had our third year this year at Hamlin University was the location this year. And we had 250 people there, and after each year's reading, all the poems read get anthologized in Poetry City, USA, an anthology of the poems read at the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read. Plus essays, reviews, interviews, and it keeps growing and growing and growing as we have all these ideas. And so the show at Bemidji tonight was the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read and Road show. And so taking this out on the road, and then we have a standing reading series at a place called Maeve's Cafe in Northeast Minneapolis. And so again, just celebrating poetry and community and bringing as many voices to as many people as we can. I wish I could take credit, but it wasn't my idea. Just before the event tonight, Sean Hill got us together and said, hey, why don't we just sort of all read at once and play off each other? So none of us really knew what was going to happen tonight. I haven't done a reading like this before, but I agree, it was very exhilarating. It felt to me, as I said during the reading, like jazz, like it must be to play jazz, you know, riffing off of everybody and playing and seeing how far you could go and coming back. And so it was very exciting, and it's something that I want to continue doing.
The format for this reading is maybe a little different from the traditional poetry reading that people think of. We took turns reading poems throughout the reading, so we would all just sort of, you know, read one poem or two poems and then sit down and let the next person read. There are four of us here today, Matt Mauck, Luann, Paula, and myself, and we sort of handed off the microphone, as it were, after one or two poems, which is different from the normal poetry reading format, where usually a poet reads for sort of a block of time, maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes. We were just sort of trying to bounce off each other and have a conversation with our poems. It makes for a very sort of spontaneous kind of reading. I find when I do it, I become a more attuned listener to my fellow poets, because other readings, I'm usually just kind of thinking about what I'm going to do. In this case, I'm trying to have a conversation with my fellow poets, and so I'm really actively listening and ready to answer.
Postcard to Nostalgia. When did my life become the stuff of nostalgia? I overheard a guy in the bar on the corner ask his beer the other day. I didn't know you had a new beau, and this one's long distance too. He reminds me of my younger brother, who, when much younger, sputtered in the ocean after the first wave took the land he had been standing on, waterlogged and hornswoggled, his goggles now around his neck, no longer a green horn to what's to come or what can come to pass. In this new city, my barber insists on cutting my hair to lessen my thinning, wanting to get back to a me he didn't know. I've taken to carrying words in my pocket on a slip of paper. Each morning, I reconsider them, and again at noon and midnight. They are my last words, or what I intend my last words to be.
It's always one of my favorite things. I think it's something that we all look forward to because it is so solitary, the coming together and the sharing what you did in solitude. And to read this way especially, I've had a friend who used to call it horse, like you start from the same spot on the floor, you know. I love it because you're really listening for the commonality in all of the poems, you know, and I always love hearing who I read with. I prefer to read in group readings, but in this way, it's so fun to hear that, like, yes, you know.
I started writing poetry as a child and then abandoned it and didn't take any poetry writing classes in college. I was an English education major going for teaching. And then I was assigned a creative writing class when I was teaching in Woodbury, Minnesota. And I started writing the assignments along with my students. And that's where I discovered or rediscovered writing poetry. And I think most poets will tell you we write poetry because we can't not write poetry. I mean, once you have that way of expressing sometimes really difficult things, sometimes happy things, it's addictive. It's a great form of expression. When students want to start writing poetry, the first thing they need to do is read poetry. So many people who write poetry sort of proudly say, I write poetry, but I never read it. And that's a frustration for people teaching poetry writing. Nobody would say, I'm going to write a novel, but I've really never read one. So educating themselves in poetry and the styles of poetry is helpful. And then just trying things. It's just a matter of putting pen to paper. One of the things I tell my students when they say, poetry, we hate poetry, is that they have more poems memorized than any other age group because they don't make the link between poetry and song lyrics. And I think so many people are intimidated by poetry because it's been poorly taught or not taught at all, or they just it didn't hit them at the right time in their life. But I hope that people will understand that there's something in poetry for everyone.
I guess it sort of goes back to this idea of, like, for me at least, poetry being about sort of training the gaze on something and being attentive. I was one of those kids who often daydreamed and gazed out the window, and my gaze was always about sort of like studying something, being, you know, looking at something closely and letting my mind kind of wander. And that for me turned out not to be conducive to writing stories. I wanted to be a writer. I had this idea, because I was a reader, I wanted to do that thing that I was reading. I wanted to write words too, write stories, and stories didn't come to me. But once I found poetry, it allowed me to actually sort of express myself and explore ideas in ways that I couldn't in stories or even essays.
I think a poetry reading in a community brings people together of like mind. Often people who attend poetry readings are writers themselves or readers. But I also think writing poetry is such a sharing of the self. And for people to come and listen to that is such a community building, true connection between the audience and the reader.
I think people should feel comfortable not necessarily understanding poetry on a literal sense all the time, or worry that they don't get it, you know, and really gravitate to poetry that they like and that moves them without worrying about if it's good or not, you know. There's a lot of poetry out there, and there's something for people to like. So.
Coming to an event like this, coming to a poetry reading is like a cheap vacation. You get to go to a lot of wonderful, weird, new worlds in one evening. Yeah.
There's a lot of you know, sort of tentacles with the Poetry Roadshow and the Maeve session. So if you want to know more about it, it's good to check out the website. The Great Twin Cities Poetry Show, the Great Twin Cities Poetry Read and Roadshow.com has tons of information. We're updating that, so that's a great place to find information and to contact me if you have questions.
If you enjoyed this segment of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org. If you have segment ideas pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund by the vote of the people on November 4th, 2008.